We're going to get started in just a minute or two, giving everyone enough time to get logged into the system, and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started just to respect everyone's time this evening. So good evening. My name is Maddie. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist here at WFYI. Our mission here at WFYI is to provide trusted journalism, inspiring stories, and lifelong learning. We do that through our vision, which is to have an informed, inspired, and inclusive Indiana. We're committed to representing rich diversity in our community and amplifying stories and experiences that represent the experiences of all, which is what we're hoping to do here tonight. We want to thank you for joining us and hope you will find the information helpful. Here's just a couple of reminders. We will have an additional webinar next Thursday discussing school discipline around children with disabilities. After both webinars, we will be sending a follow-up email with information from a variety of organizations, and in time, there will be both the recordings of both webinars on our YouTube page. You can submit questions through the Q&A chat box on your screen throughout the webinar. And then these webinars are not legal advice. We just want to give you that reminder. We would like to thank Ability Allies and ARC of Indiana for their contributions and participation in the webinar today. So moderating our Q&A today will be Dylan from WFYI. Dylan is an award-winning journalist with more than a decade of experience covering education, families, and communities. Her reporting has prompted Indiana to return schools to local control, increase scrutiny of graduation rates, and exposed how the state violated federal law by allowing people with emergency permits to teach special education. From Ability Allies, we have Mimi Huybers. Mimi represents parents and students in legal matters arising under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Article 7 and Section 504. She represents frequent trainings and seminars about special education matters to parents and professional groups. She is also an adjunct faculty member at the IU School of Education in Indianapolis. From ARC of Indiana, we have Tom Crishon. His current role title is Chief Legal Officer. Tom oversees legal strategy, public policy, and the ARC Master Trust. He worked for 14 years at Indiana Disability Rights, and the last 5 of those years he worked as General Counsel and Legal Director. From 2019 to 2020, he was part of the Education Dispute Resolution Working Group. He is currently a member of the Commission on Seclusion and Restraint in Schools. Mimi, let's have you get us started.
Sure. Thanks so much, Maddie, and thank you for having me tonight. Thanks for going back to that. I just wanted to talk a little bit more briefly about Ability Allies. You've got some information here on the slide. There are lots of different nonprofit organizations in Indiana that thankfully that exists to help families who have children with disabilities. But it can be kind of confusing to figure out who does what. If you can just remember that all we really do is handle special education matters. And in doing that, we provide direct service to families, and we only serve families with limited economic means. And so they have to qualify under a certain low income threshold. And then we provide free public education trainings and seminars like this one to the community. So regarding the advocacy and legal services, like I said, kind of the key three factors are, does the family qualify based on the low income criteria? And does it have a child with a disability, and do they have education related concerns? And so if you've got someone who is interested in our services, just have them look on our website, and application for presentations and our services are listed. So yes, thanks, Maddie. So first, we're going to talk about case conference committees and the IEP development. And I just wanted to note that we could talk for days about the topics that we're going to cover tonight, diving deeply into all of these different issues. We're going to try and cover them quickly in 30 minutes so that we've got 30 minutes to have question and answers at the end. So I'm going to talk fast, and I'm going to try to stick to the info I have so that Tom still has time to talk for his second half. And we also, due to the title of this, we're assuming that somebody has been, the student has been through the special education process, they've qualified for an IEP, and the parent is preparing for the case conference meeting and trying to understand what this whole new world is all about. So first, I just want to cover that the case conference committee, that's who develops a student's individualized education program. And so if you don't even realize what that IEP stands for, that's what IEP is, individualized education program, with a big key being individualized. And the case conference committee writes it. Indiana's special education rules use the term case conference committee. A lot of times schools will use IEP team. They're pretty much interchangeable. But IEP development is not left solely up to the school. The parent is a vital part, and we'll talk about that in a minute, of the case conference committee. And it's up to the entire committee to determine what should be in a student's IEP. Students with a disability have a right to a free and appropriate public education. FAPE is what the IEP is supposed to be providing. And free public education, all of those words are easy to understand, but appropriate's a little bit tougher. And it's subjective, and there can be lots of disagreements about that. And Tom's going to talk a little bit later in a few slides about what happens in those situations. And it needs to be designed to meet the student's unique needs. And so it's not supposed to be a cookie cutter situation where all students with autism get these particular things in their IEP. It's required, the law requires the IEP to meet the student's unique needs. From there, there are certain things that are required to be in the IEP. The student's present levels, for instance, that helps figure out where the student is. And then goals will determine where we want that student to get to and where we want them to be in, say, a year from now is the usual time frame. Also, special education and related services. We'll talk about those on the next slide, I think it is. And then the case conference committee is also going to decide where this education and the services are going to be provided for that student. And that's another slide we're going to cover. So if you can move on, Maddie. So talking a little bit about IEP services, and just like the other aspects of the IEP, the case conference committee is who determines these services. Special education and related services are supposed to enable the student to advance appropriately towards attaining their goals. And we've got a little bit more clarity from a Supreme Court case that came down a few years ago. And that case states that the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And it also said that the IEP must be appropriately ambitious to allow for meaningful advancement. And so that rejected a standard that we had, not to get too into the weeds about law, but previously, the IEP really was only required to provide a minimum benefit if that was kind of considered enough. And so that kind of raised the bar and was a good thing for students with disabilities. Regarding special education services, they include educational instruction, and that's kind of what most people think about when they think about special education services. But it's important to note that it can also include physical education instruction, travel training, if a student needs it, transition services, vocational education, if applicable, and speech and language services are listed as a special education service. And then we've got different types of related services, and these are developmental, corrective, and other supportive services that are necessary to help the student benefit from their special education. And not all students are going to qualify for related services, so don't panic if your child doesn't have them listed, unless they need them, of course. And so then you should have a discussion about them, and Tom's going to talk about how to address those situations. But related services should, or some examples of them include special transportation, audiology services, counseling, interpretation services, occupational physical therapy, parent counseling. It's a really long list. And so if you've got questions or want to know more about related services, just take a look in Article 7, and we've got a list. There is a list that will provide all of the different types. Next, we're talking about least restrictive environment. And so this is a key principle in special education, LRE. And the requirement is that to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers. And I also like to when I talk about LRE, I like to make sure to note that LRE is not necessarily really a location. It is really based upon the amount of time that the student spends with their non-disabled peers. I also like to point out that oftentimes folks will use placement or inclusion kind of interchangeable with LRE. They're not technically the same thing, but if you hear those things being used interchangeably, that's probably, they're all probably being or intending to mean least restrictive environment. And with least restrictive environment, the intention is that we want the student to be educated in the general education setting if possible, and if necessary, with the help of supplementary aids and services. And so those can include things like accommodations, modifications, specialized instruction, and removal from the general education setting, or really removal from any placement should only occur if the IEP team determines that the student cannot be educated satisfactorily in that placement, even with the supplementary aids and supports. The decision to move placements requires an IEP meeting, and the parent will have the opportunity to challenge. Tom's going to talk about that. And schools are also required to provide a continuum of special education placements that go all the way from general education classroom through resource rooms, separate classrooms, even down to residential schools and homebound. Moving on to parent and guardian's role at a case conference meeting. So parents are an equal and essential member of the case conference committee team. It's really easy to feel intimidated because there are lots of school staff members at the case conference meeting. They've got lots of education and training about special education, teaching, and all of those things. But parents have very substantial rights in the special education rules. And parents also have really the final say regarding the IEP because they always have the opportunity to challenge the IEP if they're in disagreement with them, with it. And so I think having that information is empowering and good, something good for a parent to remember. Also remember that you're an expert when it comes to your child. Staff might be experts in lots of different things, but probably nobody at that table knows your child better than you do. So share information about your child's strengths, challenges, any other relevant information that might be helpful that maybe they wouldn't find in your child's evaluation or already in the IEP that might be helpful for them to know. At the meeting, collaborate and advocate with the school and advocate if necessary. Try to work with the school, not against it if possible. Keep your child and your child's needs as the focus. That's often really helpful to remember that it's not about winning or trying to beat the school. You want to try to get the best IEP for your child. And it's also helpful to focus on facts, data, and other objective information rather than using maybe emotionally charged language when you're in the meeting. And then it's important to take note of key decisions and IEP provisions so that after the meeting you can look through it and make sure everything was included and that it's accurate. And then if you're preparing for your case conference committee meeting or IEP meeting, you want to educate yourself about the process. The special education process is confusing and what your rights are in that process. Like I said, parents have a lot of rights when it comes to having a say in their child's education. And so trainings like this, I think, Maddie, I don't know if you've got the Article 7, a link, or maybe Maddie, you'll be sharing it in that follow-up information with the folks who've all registered. But Article 7 is what we call Indiana's special education rules. The Indiana Department of Ed has a great guidance document that helps explain some of the key sections in a lot easier to understand, less legalistic language. And then there are lots of organizations around the state that provide trainings. And for instance, InSource is an organization that has lots of trainings on their website that you could just participate in at the company. You can just, queue them up and watch them at 10 o'clock at night if that's your only opportunity to get to start learning more. Gather and review documents before the meeting. Get your students, if your student already has an IEP, get that, take a look at it, get goal progress reports on how your student's already doing with their goals, report cards, assessment reports, schoolwork. If there are concerns that you want to bring to the meeting regarding the schoolwork, behavioral referral documents, if those if that situation applies for your child and they've got behaviors, maybe medical information if there's medical info you're willing to share. Make a list of all of your questions and concerns, and it's probably a good idea to prioritize your list because the meetings run long, there's lots of information to cover, and so you want to make sure that your key concerns are addressed first. And then maybe things that can be addressed at a future meeting are left to the bottom. It might be appropriate to talk to your child about how things are going at school and their IEP and their services. And are they getting their services? Do they like some of the accommodations, especially as a kiddo gets older and they become more aware that, hey, maybe special ed It's not so cool to look different than all the other students. So they might want to provide some input on how they might want to access their accommodations or have ideas about things that could help them. And then lastly, invite others. Try to take someone with you, even if they don't know anything about IEPs. That person can just be there to be a support to you, an extra set of eyes and ears. Have them take notes. It's really hard to be engaged, listening, sharing information, and also being the note taker. So just have that person be there to take notes and write things down. Tom's also going to talk about how now schools are no longer allowed to pass any sort of rules regarding prohibiting recording of meetings. So he'll talk about that in a minute. And then if your child has therapists outside of school or other providers that you think could share some information, invite them to the meeting, or just have them provide some written information if you think that would be helpful. All right, all yours, Tom.
Excellent. Thanks, Mimi. First thing, let me just address, I woke up without a voice this morning, which is perfect when you're scheduled to present in a webinar. So apologies in advance if my voice cracks or fades. I promise it is not for dramatic effect. As Maddie mentioned, my name is Tom Crishon. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for the ARC of Indiana. If you're unfamiliar, the ARC is a statewide nonprofit that provides advocacy services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We have a variety of programs. We do public policy work. We have the ARC Master Trust, the Erskine Green Training Institute, as well as the ARC Advocacy Network, where we have a group of very, very good family advocates who are happy to provide information, referrals, and walk anyone through many, many issues, including special education. So feel free to contact us whenever, and we'd be happy to assist along the way. So Mimi did an excellent job walking through kind of the case conference committee, IEP development, and some of the important requirements. Kind of where I pick up the conversation is we oftentimes hear families come and say, okay, something isn't working, but we're not sure what to do. What can we do? So that's where I kind of want to pick up here. The first step is to write down what you're seeing at home or in the classroom. Specific examples are incredibly helpful. For example, my child's supposed to get 30 minutes of reading support daily, but I'm only seeing it happen twice a week. My daughter is still not able to independently complete assignments, even though that was one of the goals with accommodations. Like, be very concrete on writing these things down and noting how things are going. From there, the most important thing you can do is request a case conference committee, a IEP meeting, as Mimi mentioned, is sometimes called, in writing. You don't have to wait until the annual meeting. If an IEP is not effective, you can ask for a meeting at any time, and the school has an obligation to respond to that. During that meeting, Mimi mentioned this, I'm going to repeat a couple of the important aspects here. It's important to keep the conversation centered on data and impact. What evidence shows the IEP isn't working? Is the student making progress or is not making progress toward goals? Are accommodations being provided consistently? Are services actually addressing the barriers that exist? Be very clear about what is and is not working and what you'd like to see from a change standpoint. Maybe you want a goal that is modified, a service that is added, a different instructional strategy tried. The more specific you are, the easier it is for the school team to respond to that request. But really more important than anything, I think this is about empowering families and recognizing that families have power here. You don't have to wait until the school brings something up. If it's not working, you can initiate the conversation and go from there. But one thing that we always hear, and I think everyone needs to recognize, that disagreements are normal, okay? You have to recognize every single parent who has been in special education system for really any amount of time will run into a moment when something doesn't feel right, where they don't agree with a decision that the school is making. What happens then is it's always best practice to start with the teacher. They often have the day-to-day perspective that may help clear up a misunderstanding quickly. Sometimes it's something small that can be addressed immediately by the teacher. If the issue is not resolved there, the next recommended step would be the special education director. I can't emphasize this enough. This is a step that is often missed. Special education directors have a broader view of the school resources, the policies, and really the flexibility the school has. They can be used to navigate very tricky situations that maybe the teacher cannot, and they often can resolve things before they have to escalate further. So that is always the next step that I would recommend. When we get calls and it's to a certain step of the house is on fire, everything's going bad. The question we ask is, have you talked to the special education director yet? Because that can resolve the issue oftentimes, and really, frankly, save weeks, if not months, of frustration if they skip that step. Throughout all of this, it's important to try to keep the communication solution focused. I know that is extraordinarily difficult, and I want to recognize and acknowledge that this can be a very, very difficult situation when your child is not getting the education you feel they should get. But it is important to keep the communication solution focused. It's important not to focus on who's at fault or what someone didn't do, but what the student needs and how we can get there. And that's the key here. When both sides stay centered on the child's progress, the conversation becomes a lot more productive, and solutions can be had a lot easier when we do that. However, I know that can't always happen. So I want to talk about some of the dispute resolution options that you have if you've gone through these steps and something still isn't right. When something isn't working, the goal is always to resolve it as early and informally as possible. This will save weeks of time, but also it will help maintain relationships. And for better or not, your child is probably going to stay at the school for many, many years, and you're going to be dealing with the same individuals for many, many years. So maintaining and preserving that relationship as best you can is going to be the end goal and the best thing for your child. So resolving things as early as informally as possible is ideal. Most disagreements can be fixed long before they get to anything formal or legal. And when we get to formal or legal, it can be a very, very long process. But one of the informal things to do, and again, I mentioned this earlier, is one of the best tools that you have is simply requesting a case conference committee meeting. You can do this anytime. As I mentioned, you don't have to wait for an annual review. You don't have to wait for them to bring it up. A meeting allows everyone involved, the entire IEP team, which you're a part of as a parent, to look at the data, to clarify misunderstandings, to talk through possible changes. If you feel unsure about the process, which I know it can be very intimidating, especially if you're new to the special education world, or maybe you just want some backup, it is absolutely okay to ask for an advocate. Groups like the Arc of Indiana, Ability Allies, Mimi mentioned InSource, Indiana Disability Rights, they have advocates there that day in and day out can walk with you along this process and help you understand your rights, help you think through what you may want to propose, and can help communicate it more effectively with the school, especially in what can be an emotionally charged situation. So please don't feel like you have to navigate all of this alone. Another option is a facilitated IEP meeting. This brings a neutral facilitator who can help keep the discussion productive and focused. It's a great tool that you can feel when communication really breaks down and you don't think you can go in that room and figure this out yourself. You can utilize the facilitated IEP process to really break any tension that's in the room. No matter what route you take, make sure you stay organized. Keep copies of emails, notes of conversations, data you might be tracking, you should be tracking at home. Really having that information in one place makes it much easier to explain your concerns and really bring it to the full picture. But the goal of all these informal steps is to, again, fix problems quickly and collaboratively before you need to move on to formal dispute resolution, which, again, there are options. So if you do need to move on to formal, you have really three options here. You have a complaint process, you can have mediation, and you can have a due process hearing. And I'll briefly touch on these three. So most disagreements can be resolved informally, but sometimes it gets to the point where you just simply aren't moving the needle. What you can do first is a complaint. And a complaint is made with the Indiana Department of Education. The complaint is appropriate when you believe the school has violated the special education rules. So as Mimi mentioned, Article 7 IDEA If you feel like they have violated those rules, a complaint is appropriate. This can be something like services not being provided as written, missed minutes, lack of progress monitoring, timelines not followed, placement decision being made outside of the case conference process. When you file a complaint, the Department of Education will investigate the issue. They'll talk to the school, they'll review records, and they will issue a written decision. The decision will say whether there is a violation that's been made and if the school has to do something to correct it. So a complaint must allege a violation that's occurred 1 year, within 1 year of the date of the complaint being received. So just from a timeline standpoint, a few things to remember: complaints are free. They tend to be much quicker than due process, and they're focused on whether the school followed the law, not who's right or wrong. So just keep that in mind. If you need to move on to another solution, mediation is a great option. We always encourage people to consider mediation before jumping into something further. Mediation is voluntary, so both parties have to agree to participate. Hopefully, a school will agree if the parent's bringing it forward. Not always, though. So if both parties don't agree, then it's not an option. But note that everything is confidential, so discussions stay in that room. A neutral mediator, someone who has no stake in the outcome, kind of guides the conversation and makes sure everyone is heard. The goal isn't You shouldn't walk into this with a goal of, I want to win. The goal is to find a solution that everyone can live with and making sure that we're meeting the students' needs. Mediation, again, is free. It's always faster than going through due process. The final step, and the most formal, most legalistic step, is a due process hearing. This is a legal proceeding before an impartial hearing officer. Frankly, think about it like a mini trial, because that's what it is. There are witnesses, there's evidence, there's legal arguments, there's timelines. Families often find this route complex because it is. But this is for really complex and serious disputes. This is where maybe disagreements about eligibility ends up here. Maybe we have a placement issue, significant services, or maybe a major safety concern, or something where it's been especially egregious, and you need to take it to due process. That's where it's most appropriate. Due process can result in meaningful remedies, but it's also very, very time constraining, and it can strain relationships with the school. So keep that in mind, because again, you have to maintain these relationships for many, many years often. It often also requires legal representation because it is a very legal process. So we usually say this is a last resort at some point before you move here. I'll note a due process hearing request must allege a violation that has occurred no more than 2 years before the date that the parent or the public agency knew or should have known about the alleged action that prompts the due process. So from a timing standpoint, you've got 2 years. But the most important thing families can do is that you have options at every level: informal, collaborative, and formal. And depending on what the situation requires, that should be a consideration. Very quickly, just some helpful tips. Mimi mentioned these as well, but I want to kind of stress some of these. Please put everything in writing. Verbal conversations are great for relationship building, but if you need to request a meeting, ask for a change in IEP, follow up on something important, just send a quick email afterward. Just have it in writing that creates a clear record of what was said and what you're asking for. Stay polite but persistent. Special education, I know, is emotional. This is your child, and you know them better than anyone. But professionalism and consistency can go a very long way in keeping communication productive and maintaining relationships. I want to stress here, being firm doesn't mean being confrontational. So just keep that in mind. Keep records of meetings, emails, progress reports, anything you're seeing at home. And always remember, you are an equal member of that IEP team. The school brings expertise, there's no doubt about it, but you bring expertise as well. You know your strengths, your child's strengths, you know their needs, you know what works best for them. Your input is not optional, it is required by the IDEA. So keep that in mind. You are an equal member of the team. And finally, do not have to do this alone. There are advocacies like Mimi's, like mine, who can assist you, even if it's just answering questions about the process. 2 quick updates on some new laws that passed this year before we jump into questions and answers. I want to mention the first one being Senate Enrolled Act 409. Again, both these just passed this last 2025 session, and they're very important when you are in this space. So recognizing that these are important for you. Senate Enrolled Act 409 Employees may not take adverse employment action against employees who are absent from work as a result of attending either their child's attendance conference for missing too many days or their case conference committee meeting. Each employee is permitted to one absence per year under this law. I fully recognize that it may take more than one case conference in a year, but just please understand this was not going to get passed if it had more than that. So we start with one absence per year being protected. You may also say this is ridiculous. Why is this even needed? Unfortunately, we were hearing from employees and parents that this was needed. So you are protected from attending one educational meeting per year, from taking adverse employment action by the employer. I will note the absence it must be no longer than reasonably necessary. The employee must provide 5 days notice of the meeting, and the employee shall make every reasonable effort to schedule the meeting virtually. These are all caveats that are built into the law, but I want to note that there are protections there for you. FMLA may also provide protections above and beyond this one. If there's a qualifying serious health condition and the individual is eligible for FMLA, I just want to make mention there as well. Lastly, House Enrolled Act 1285, and Mimi mentioned this, a school corporation may not adopt a policy or otherwise prevent the parent of a student from recording a meeting concerning the student's IEP. We have heard that there were a few school districts that adopted policies that would prohibit recordings. I'm not going to get into the legal argument that was probably illegal anyway, that policy. But now we have a state law, HCA 1285, that you can specifically and explicitly point to and saying you cannot prevent me from recording this, which for a number of reasons is necessary, whether the other family member cannot attend, so you want to reference it. You want to record it just to reference it back. Maybe you don't have great memory and or you want a documentation of what was discussed. There's a variety of reasons why you may want to record it, and 1285 mandates that a school cannot prevent you from doing so. So with that, I hope that you could hear and understand me throughout all of it, and we will move to questions and answers at this point.
Thank you, Tom and Mimi. Like they said, thank you so much for taking the time to present that. So we're going to go ahead and get into our panel discussion. Again, feel free to submit any additional questions. We did take questions ahead of time when you registered as well. So we've taken that all into consideration. So go ahead, Dylan. Let's get us started.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to join you. As Madison mentioned, a lot of these questions are adapted from questions that we got from participants in advance. And I just want to start right off. Are districts required to allow staff from applied behavioral analysis centers, which typically work with students with autism, into schools? If not, is there anything that parents can do to advocate for that or find districts that might be more open to having ABA staff in their schools? And I'll start with Tom.
Thanks, Dylan, for that question. So a very, very important and really timely question with all of the ABA therapy changes that are happening. Schools must provide supports based on the individual needs of a student, not a particular diagnosis necessarily. Schools are not required to provide ABA therapy, and most do not. So I just want to kind of put that out there right now. Whether or not schools allow outside ABA or BCBA staff in the building is a local decision, but it's not required by the IDEA. Families can certainly access community ABA separately. I will note that I have been hearing rumblings that there might be a bill presented this year at the legislative session that may address this very thing and mandate that schools allow ABA and BCBA staff into the school. But as it stands right now, there's not a requirement that that the school must allow an outside ABA therapist in, or a mandate that they actually provide quote unquote ABA therapy to the child.
All right, I have a question from one of our attendees. How can parents and guardians advocate for children who are gifted and have disabilities? I think from either of you. Oh, maybe I think you're muted.
Sorry, I do that all the time. I can go ahead and take that since Tom did the last one. This is a difficult situation. We, you just, the school needs, under the IEP, like we said, the school needs to be able to, or needs to provide whatever what the student needs in order to be educated. And so just because a student is gifted, there are, and I touched on this a little bit, there are, or it's not necessarily, services don't necessarily have to be applicable to academic needs. And so the IEP is supposed to address also the student's functional needs. And so I think in one of my slides, I had referenced that, that can be communication, that could be things like behavior, socialization, and things like that. And so like if we've got a kiddo that is doing really, really well from an academic standpoint, but the school is saying things like, well, your student shouldn't have an IEP because look at how smart your child is, or look at their test scores. They're at the top, but your child maybe has struggles with executive functioning skills, which include things like time management and like breaking down different parts of a project to know like where to even begin working on it first. All of those types of things, just organization of their, of their locker and their folder and their materials and things like that. Those are still things that a student can qualify for an IEP and have no academic need for the IEP. And so I'm not exactly sure what if that's what they were kind of getting at, but I think those are common situations where we've got a really gifted and exceptionally bright student, and that we see that the school is then going to say, oh, well, no need for an IEP here, but recognize that they're not allowed to just look at academics.
Thank you.
So Indiana has passed laws in the last 2 sessions that aim to improve student attendance. Those are focused on truancy, which is unexcused absences, but it's also local school districts that determine what is an excused and what is an unexcused absence. So can you talk a little bit, and I'm going to hand this one off to Tom, can you talk a little bit about how these laws are affecting students with disabilities and whether there are exceptions for those students? And feel free to hop in after Mimi if you want to add anything.
So it's something we're paying attention to. As you mentioned, these are kind of relatively new laws, and with the school accountability integrate kind of overlapping and working with the truancy laws and the habitual absence laws, there are a concern that students with disabilities might be kind of disparately impacted more than students without disabilities. So we need to, what we're paying attention to is making sure that schools are considering disability-related factors in those absences requirements, but also we're working with DOE to make sure that they're not inadvertently holding schools negatively accountable when those absences might be disability related. So it is something that we were concerned about when it was passed, and we remain kind of monitoring to see if it's going to have a negative impact. The other massive concern, which would be a very, very clear violation of IDEA, is if schools are concerned about the accountability aspect of the absences and are communicating explicitly or implicitly to the child, maybe you should look elsewhere, whether it be a different school or a different school setting, so that those absences aren't counting toward their accountability score. So yes, it is something we're concerned about, but there should be disability-related factors that are considered. I don't know if Mimi has anything to add there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that really the big key is that I believe the laws are really talking about unexcused absence. And so really the key is to make sure, if your child has an absence related to their disability, make sure that you get that doctor's note and have a doctor's note even on file with the school if your child's going to have frequent absences related to their disability. Make sure to, I guess, bottom line, make sure that you get the excused absence, because then there shouldn't be any issues.
Yeah. How can parents find out about the certification, training, and background of the staff and educators that are working with their children with disabilities?
I can jump in and just say that, this is a tough one, other than the Indiana Department of Education has an online license lookup program. And so teachers are listed in that program, and that's open to the public, and anybody can look in there. But I certainly have had parents before who've wanted to know qualifications, maybe regarding an aid or things like that. And there is no certification or requirement when it comes to that type of or those types of staff. So I guess for teachers, if it's related to a teacher, they can look on the Indiana Department of Education. I think if you just Google Indiana Department of Education teacher lookup, you should be able to easily come across that.
All right.
You can certainly ask,
Yeah, I was gonna say,
as far as forcing to,
yeah,
I mean, that's the obvious way, but if they won't share and you want to look it up, then unless it's a teacher, I'm not really sure that you can get to that info.
yeah, I was gonna say that this would be another opportunity maybe to ask the special education director directly, like Mimi mentioned, whether or not they share is another thing. But for paraprofessionals, it's easier for teachers, certainly. For paraprofessionals, training varies by district. So even if it's just a matter, you're not going to get individual specific about the actual employee, but you may want to ask about what the district uses from a qualifications, training, and supervision standpoint, and that may alleviate some of the concerns that they're looking for.
The other thing I would throw in is that if we're really not trying to look at their licensing and all of that, I mean, if the staff need to be trained in the student's specific needs, then regardless of their licensing and training, that can be, something that can be put in the IEP. So that's not a licensing thing, but if the issue is, that your child has some very specific, unique type of disability, or you feel like, this person doesn't, how to address the needs of a student with autism or whatever, that there can be requirements that the staff be trained.
All right, I have another question for either of you. What kind of reading support are schools required to provide children with dyslexia? Are evidence-based programs required?
Yeah, I can address this. So a couple years ago, there was a requirement actually put in for dyslexia-specific programming, and the law requires schools to administer a universal screening to all kindergartner, first, and second grades annually to determine if they're at risk for reading proficiency. So this is kind of determined to be the dyslexia screening that every school must do, which is a good step. Indiana schools are required to provide evidence-based structured literacy programs and approaches when someone is identified with dyslexia. So, under IDEA, reading services must be research-based. They must match the student's needs. This kind of goes back to the other question that Mimi talked about, where, somebody asked the question about especially gifted individuals or students, right? And I think that was probably geared toward the twice exceptional individuals. But, a lot of students who have dyslexia are very bright and are getting good grades already, but they're struggling because of dyslexia. And it may be a hard thing to convince the need for an IEP when there's absolutely a need for an IEP and appropriate services. So I recognize that as a tough thing to combat. But no, there is a universal screening and dyslexia programming requirement. And Indiana Department of Education actually has a guidebook for schools that detail this just for dyslexia. So you can Google that and just search for the dyslexia programming guidance for schools, and that should pop up. So districts can choose the specific programming, but it should be evidence-based and implemented based on the individual's needs.
So Mimi, you started to talk a little bit about inclusion earlier during your presentation, and I just wanted to return back to that. Does inclusion mean that all students with a disability have to be in a general education setting?
Not necessarily. So, I feel like we always go back to this, depends on what's appropriate for the child. And so, like when we were talking about least restrictive environment, and I did mention inclusion, placement, but sometimes all of those words kind of get thrown around. And sometimes parents will say, oh, inclusion, my child has to be in general education. And really what the requirement is we want the child to be in general education if it's appropriate, and the school needs to provide the necessary supports and aids and services that to help that student try to be successful in that general education setting. But if that doesn't happen, then the school or the case conference committee really can move that child to a more restrictive environment, which then really kind of becomes the least restrictive environment for that student. And so it's not necessarily that all students have to be in general education. It's just that that's kind of the goal that we would kind of strive for, and schools sometimes will make that jump, without even putting in those necessary supports that they're required to do before they move that child to a more restrictive environment, and they're not allowed to do that. So
I have a follow-up on that, which is, do schools have to tell parents how much time their kids are being pulled out versus spending in inclusion? And what do parents do if they disagree with what the school believes is the best approach for that? And either one of you are welcome to step in if you want to add anything, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, to least restrictive environment is a really, really important right that an individual has. To Mimi's point, we get some parents that think that LRE means one thing and it doesn't mean that. So I just want to stress kind of her point too, that they must be educated in a least restrictive environment to the maximum extent that is appropriate for them. So it's the most appropriate least restrictive environment for them. To your point to your question on, I think LRE absolutely has play here, but change of placement also does too. So if it's a pull out, if they say change of play, if it qualifies as a quote unquote change of placement, which is a legal terminology under IDEA, then yes, absolutely the parent needs to be involved. That needs to be a case conference decision. And there are some other legal implications with that change of placement. So depending on when and how they're being pulled out, I think that's really key. But the school should be communicating that. The other really important thing I'll just mention, sitting on the commission for seclusion and restraint in schools, depending on what that pullout looks like and where that child's going and who they're with, it could be considered a seclusion in the school, which there are a whole bevy of other rules and requirements under the law for that specifically too.
And the student's IEP really should be specifying what amount of time. In the services section of the student's IEP, it should specify where those services are occurring. Are they occurring in a special education setting, which then that would be if that student's placement is general education, or then they would be pulling that student to special education. And so a parent really should be able to look and see what the services are saying there. But then, as Tom noted, there are times where students are getting pulled that are different from what are listed there. So.
All right. And this is for either of you. Are there active Indiana organizations which provide information about autism and best practices for maximum positive growth and development?
I mean, I would say the Arc of Indiana is a very good resource, but I'm biased. There's another Indiana University, Bloomington has an Indiana Resource Center for Autism. IRCA is excellent, excellent resource as well. So you know, there are a lot of organizations. Autism Society of Indiana has another really, really good avenue to go through. So yes, there are some really, really good organizations that have good information. I think additionally, you know, not just Indiana specific, but there are other understood.org, Learning Ally. There are other organizations that may not be based in Indiana that might have really good resources for individuals to kind of learn some about techniques and materials that may be aligned for their specific needs.
So we are closing in on our last 5 minutes, but I have a couple of quick questions I thought I'd throw out there as we still have time. Can schools hold IEP meetings without parents or guardians? And I'll start with Mimi.
They're not supposed to, and as we've emphasized a lot in our presentation tonight, that really the parent involvement is key. But there are instances where if a parent is not responding, so the school has to hold a case conference meeting, an annual case conference meeting, at least one time a year. Often it's referred to as the ACR, annual conference review. And if the school is reaching out for that meeting, or because of they want to hold a meeting for another reason to discuss a potential IEP change, and that parent is not responding, then they can go ahead and hold the meeting, but they have to have documentation of their attempts to reach that parent, and be able to show that they tried to reach out to the parent, tried to hold the meeting at a time that was mutually agreeable to parent and the school, and gave the parent enough notice and did everything right. And the whole thought behind that is a parent can't just not show up and stop the school from ever making a change in the student's IEP. And so, but for those pretty extreme situations, really the answer should be no. The parent should always be included.
And can you unmute me?
Oh, I think you're unmuted on mine.
Oh, okay. I guess a final quick one for Tom in our final moments. What happens if parents or guardians refuse to sign their child's IEP?
So, yeah, so I want to mention first, just on Mimi's point on the attendance. Yes, all of that, but also too, parents do have a right to request the meeting be rescheduled. So, some schools, I don't want to say they're going to use it to try to not get the parent to be involved. I know there's some sticky situations in relationships, but it could be used to say, well, they're going to schedule at a time where the parent can't come. That's not a reasonable excuse. So it's reasonable efforts. In the situation where a parent disagrees with the IEP, they don't want to sign it, it will go into effect after a certain amount of time. So the signature is not required for the IEP to go into effect. That also allows for the opportunity to file a complaint or due process if you disagree with the complaints or with the IEP. So unfortunately, again, kind of to Mimi's point, a parent can't use their lack of participation to block access. I think the law recognized that too, that you can't use a parent's lack of signature on IEP to signal that they can't implement it. But that does start the time ticking on addressing it from one of those informal or formal due process or otherwise remedies to address the issues that they have.
I just wanted to
Awesome.
jump in on that real quick. On the initial IEP, the school cannot implement the IEP unless it has the parent's signature. But then that gets a little confusing for parents sometimes. But after the initial IEP, the child's very first IEP, any subsequent IEP that's written, we call it the 11th day rule. On the 11th school day after the parent receives it, it will automatically become effective unless the parent properly challenges that IEP.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you, Mimi and Tom, again for joining us today. As you see on your screen here, we do have a feedback form that's super helpful for all of us to know how you feel. And then we are going to have another webinar next week, more focused a little bit on discipline and disproportionalities around that. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.